This Zero Now program is brought to you with the support of our founding partners.
Allison Williman is Dr. Allison Williman is our first guest today. Allison is Executive Director of School Safety at Oxford Community Schools. And Allison, would you mind just introducing yourself and your connection to this topic, if you would mind?
Sure. Like Ara said, I oversee safety and security in Oxford Community Schools starting in November of 2022. And a lot of my work since I started there was surrounded building threat assessment teams and being able to provide training. I'm also the chair of the safety cohort for school administrators through Zero Now. I am a trainer in the NTAC model for threat assessment, as well as a master threat assessment trainer through Homeland Security.
Awesome. Yeah, and you've been great to work within Zero Now and the cohort and everything else. So welcome, Allison. We're glad you could join us. John Van Driel, welcome, John. John is a director or former director of safety and risk management services at Salem-Kelsey School District. John, would you mind introducing yourself, sir?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me here. This is a real honor. I started my career as a school psychologist, primarily at Salem-Keizer Public Schools, and really focused on youth and parents that were volatile, threatening, highly aggressive, and that led to designing and being the principal architect of a model called the Salem-Keizer, now called the Salem-Keizer Cascade model, because it's used throughout the Cascadia region, and it's also Hawaii and Oklahoma and places like that. But it is a preventive behavioral threat assessment system that uses the NTAC information and the research sets that are the defensible leading practice research sets. And so as I've moved through my career, I ended up retiring out as the director of security and threat assessment and risk management for Salem-Keizer, and started my own company where I've now been consulting with school districts around the country on implementing behavioral threat assessment models, usually similar to the Salem-Keizer Cascade model. And as of today, I am the I have a new title. It is Chief Architect of Violence Prevention Solutions for Public Consulting Group. So my company and my practice merged with them, and I'm under the umbrella of Public Consulting Group, which allows me to really expand the scope of my work and add a lot of resources for my clients.
Awesome. A great resource, John, and also a musician. So that's a whole different conversation on that. But no, it's glad you could join us, John. And I know you have a wealth of knowledge there with us. Glenn Moore. Glenn is the Director of Threat Management at the Missouri School Board Association Center for Education Safety. Glenn, would you mind just introducing yourself, sir?
Sure. My background is in law enforcement. I have about 27 years in law enforcement, and I did a lot of the tactical side of things too. And eventually I was directed towards the school side of things. And so my tours have been in Southern and Central California and now South Central Missouri. So I have about 16 years as an SRO, and I went back to school, got my master's in social work. So I apply some of the mental health response capabilities to our district too. And then for the last few years, I've been lead on our teaching of threat assessment throughout schools in Missouri.
And Glenn, we were chatting earlier. I mean, it's really looking forward to an opportunity to learn what you're doing in Missouri and your background across different disciplines. And that's part of the essence of Zero Now is sharing these ideas and leading practices from all across the country. So we hope that folks that are participating will join in on some of our roundtables that we have. We'll start those up again in September. And just want to remind folks, if you have a question for Allison, Glenn, or John, please hit the Q&A button. We have a lot of questions that came in beforehand. So please hit the Q&A button and type in your question, then we'll answer those as we go along. So before we get started, I just want to, we assume that folks know exactly the topic we're talking about, but for folks that may not really have a good understanding of what behavior threat assessment is, John, would you mind just defining what is BTAM, behavior threat assessment and management, from your perspective?
Absolutely. And I want to add a word to BTAM, and that's preventive. So something that I like to try to add whenever I can. It is a prevention system. It's not a gotcha system. It's not a system that's been developed to figure out ways to arrest and expel kids. It's actually a system that we use to keep that from happening, to stop kids within a pathway that they're in, or adults, a pathway that they're in that is leading to the likely outcome or a possible outcome of something we call targeted violence. So the textbook definition of what behavioral threat assessment is it's a process that is centered on analysis and facts. So intuition and gut feeling can be a part of that, but you're looking at facts and evidence of behavior, not so much the student, but the student's behavior and circumstances in a given situation. So this is a situation involving threats directed at, or the implication of threats, or danger, violence posed at another group or a person. And it's that situation that we analyze, and that may include behavioral histories, but for the most part, we're collecting information about that situation, and we're focusing on actions, communications, and those specific circumstances that would suggest that the individual we're worried about, or the group we're worried about, intends to mount an attack and is engaged in planning and preparing for that attack. So it's not just the communication or the idea, it's all of the behavioral indicators or the circumstantial indicators that will tell us that they indeed are considering this attack. And the easiest way to just kind of paraphrase that is a bumper sticker, kind of a bumper sticker statement. And that is that we're not looking to define someone as dangerous or someone who's made a threat, but someone who is in a situation that poses a threat. The basic premise is that all humans are very dangerous in the right situations, under the certain circumstances where they feel a need to defend themselves or attack. And so we're just looking to see if those circumstances exist with a particular student or person of concern. So it's not about whether they're dangerous or not, it's whether they pose a threat of danger to other people.
And Glenn, would you associate, is it, or John, actually, I'll right back at you here, because since you're answering this question, is it just harm to others, or is it also self-harm that would qualify for a behavior threat assessment process?
It's harm directed at others. Self-harm would be a suicide risk assessment or self-harm assessment. Now, that said, if someone is considering ending their life or having their life ended, like they have a wish to die or be killed, and they are also thinking of hurting other people, their risk goes up considerably. So that kind of suicidality is a feature of the question regime that we ask when we're doing a threat assessment. But you would not want to use the questions for a preventive behavioral threat assessment for a suicide risk assessment. They're similar, but they're not the same. And so you'd be kind of asking the wrong questions in the wrong way.
Got it. Allison.
And I think it's good to keep in mind that it could be a both and. You could be doing a threat assessment and a suicide risk assessment. There may be times when both of those come into play. Also, getting into the idea of BTAM, that management piece. We want to move them off of a pathway of violence to a pathway to care. That management piece is so key in how we're supporting them, along with the multidisciplinary team. It's not up to one person to make the decision. When you look at those of us on the panel today, we come from different backgrounds, different parts of the country. We all bring our unique perspectives to be able to look at the situation as well. And everyone would have a strong voice in the room. It wouldn't be up to you, Ara, as the host, to be the leader. It would be all of us together working on this.
Exactly. And Allison, in your district, so what does your behavior threat assessment team look like? Who's part of that team?
Okay. So it's even in our board policy, we've really made it clear, and it aligns with what NTAC says, the National Threat Assessment Center through Secret Service. We have at least one school administrator, at least one mental health professional. We've added the additional with at least a master's degree or higher, because we do have some mental health professionals in our district with bachelors, but we want to look at that specialized training within mental health. And then we also require a school resource officer to be part of it. And then if there's any specialized service services, such as if the student has an IEP, a 504, is an emergent, is an L student, we want to include that staff as part of it at the bare minimum, because again, all of those perspectives, and I'm going to steal Dr. Melissa Reeves' quote, one of my favorites, is you have to collect the dots to connect the dots. And having everyone with a seat at the table, if it's a student with an IEP or a student who's receiving L services, you want to be able to ensure that their IEP is being looked at, is their behavior plan, along with if they're limited English proficient, is there a language barrier? We don't want that to be a reason as we're talking to a kid or parents that there's any additional trauma when dealing with threat assessment.
So you said something interesting, Allison, and Glenn. What mechanisms are there to collect the dots? What are there reporting mechanisms to report behavior of concern, whether you're a teacher, a student, a parent? I mean, what type of mechanisms are there to collect those dots, as Allison mentioned?
Yeah, so one of the key components is having some type of tip line that can be anonymous. And most states are pretty good about establishing these already. And one of the deficits, though, is kind of the marketing of it, so the kids and adults and different stakeholders understand that that's available and what it's for. So that's a continual process. But what we find too, each school and states are structured differently, but Missouri has a lot of small districts, kind of similar. Texas has a lot of small individualized districts, but some are county-based, so they're a little larger. But for us, we find that a lot of our schools, the reporting comes from the relationships directly from the students to the staff members. So they will know someone that they have that trusting relationship with, and they'll report directly because they've established that. But we always advocate for multiple doors that they can go through, so those opportunities are always there. But we've seen a lot of averted acts that are from family members reporting. It could be a grandparent or a parent or someone that's concerned and seeing something problematic. So we really want to push out beyond just the school setting, but making sure that there's a little bit of public relations efforts towards the greater picture.
There's an interesting question from Martin in the chat. So, John, what about a district that doesn't have the resources, the funding to have the staff, like Allison mentioned? If you are limited by your resources, how do you design a team around that?
That's common, very common. I think I've trained over 2,000 school districts, maybe well over that at this point. It's hard to keep track, but the majority of those districts did not have a lot of resources. So the first rule of thumb is you do the most you can with the resources you have and the information you have. And you gather that information in a defensible way. And that isn't just whatever's in front of you, like, immediacy bias, but you're drilling down. If you don't have the resources to have a master's level mental health professional, which is in a school, usually a social worker, school psych, or a school counselor, then you can go with the next person who has the highest level of training in mental health, and that is often a special ed teacher because they've had to take a class or two. It could be an administrator, but what you want to do is have those three hats at your team: law enforcement or close, school administration, which you absolutely can have because your administrator's job description is health and safety, and they case manage. And then school-based mental health, or if you don't have school-based mental health and you have a contract with a public health agency, a memorandum of understanding, and trying to work them into the team. And then you can work with the FERPA issues, the protection of confidentiality issues. But let's say you don't even have that. I would go with the most defensible strategies to choose someone who has the highest level of mental health understanding, and then try to work an advisor into that conversation. An advisor is usually available through public health. And I've not been in one situation where public health department, children's mental health, isn't at least willing to provide a consultation over the phone to the school and the person who's trying to represent that mental health hat. They're not there to do diagnostics in the first place. So having any kind of clinical or diagnostic expertise is great, but it's not essential. It's really more their perspective. If you can't have sworn law enforcement, like an SRO or a sheriff's deputy, again, through some sort of intergovernmental agency agreement, which usually is possible, then you choose your next closest person, and that is the person with the security hat. And if you have a security team in your school and they have some sort of certification they have to acquire through their training, through the state agency that licensed security folks, you're doing the best you can with resources. But at the end of the day, if you can get some sort of a lifeline to that professional, to law enforcement or public health, into the school as a consultant on cases, then I believe you would be defensible in the fidelity of your system. That's what I've seen people do most of the time, is they just take what they've got and then build a relationship with their community partners to help them out.
Glenn, please jump in.
I 100% what John said, and but we've seen some interesting things too, where we've leveraged some of the federal resources that people may not expect for this. They think they may be too much of an overreach, or maybe just beyond the scope of what you're dealing with. But each FBI field office has folks trained specifically in this. And they're usually not even capable of arresting a juvenile. So people think, oh, you're bringing in the federal agents to do this, but their goal is just to help and assist and advise. So your fusion center is another potential resource that may be able to direct you toward or guide you, or be able to look at open source analytics. Those oftentimes aren't needed. But if you have a very serious case that generates a lot of concern in your district, those could be a starting point, and they hopefully are tapped into more localized resources to be able to guide you to. But I agree with John, do the legwork up front, create those relationships, and find localized response options. But just know also that there are some folks out there that they're willing to jump in and help out.
And that's just to echo what both of them said, that relationship piece is key. Even tapping into your emergency managers. I know Homeland Security has different representatives throughout the country. So if there is a situation where you don't have the staff that's recommended, how can we partner with other people to get that? And as we see more and more fusion centers being created throughout the country, those smaller districts are going to be able to get the support they need. Or even focusing on things like having a district level trained team that can help you and support as you're getting more training, because we all know funding is an issue for everyone. And so as we look forward, what's going to give you the most? And when we think about threat assessment teams, we're thinking about the threat assessment itself, which is a little different than the rest of safety planning. It's not, you want to ensure that you're including the people on the team that are going to be able to be a multidisciplinary team to make those decisions about specific student instances. And I saw that there was a question in the chat. So it's not a team where you would want to include other parents or students, as that would violate FERPA. And so you just want to keep that in mind as well as you're creating your multidisciplinary team.
No, that makes sense. And as you know, we're talking through this in Allison, that from our conversations the last several months, I mean, the common theme that school safety is everyone's responsibility and everyone has a stake. And this is not just the safety director, the superintendent, the principal, or Glenn at the state level, but it is everyone's responsibility, right? Everyone has a role in this. John, you mentioned earlier about the Salem Kaiser model. I mean, is there a standard model for BTAM that anyone could just adopt and say, okay, we're going to implement this regardless of the resources that we have, but these are the functions that need to happen when it comes to behavior threat assessment?
Yeah, there are a couple, there are a lot of models, and I think what you would want to look at is whether they have an evidence-based structure, and that could either be because they have research that supports the model, like the Salem Kaiser Cascade model or the CSTAG, for example, and NTAC, or it could be a model that uses evidence-based solutions. So like trauma-informed care, for example, or restorative practice. However, the most important thing is really the questions you ask and the multidisciplinary team and their training on how to ask those questions and do the investigation. And then the flip side of that, that's the easy part. The hard part is the management, the prevention work, the connections, the keeping kids close to us rather than excluding them. And so if you have a model that does those things and it works at a grassroots level, those models do exist. They articulate those concepts. The model that I developed as a school psychologist. So I was working with principals and counselors and parents and kids. So the way I designed it was something that very much is grown from a school culture, from an education culture. And it is considered a leading practice model and evidence-based. And I'm not here to sell that model, but it is an example. And I have a website, and there are a lot of resources on that website. It's just johnvandrielconsulting.com. And you can link to multiple articles and research sets that will help you in deciding what kind of model and how to go about getting training for that model, including my own and all of the NTAC stuff, articles that support that, all of the research stuff. But you do, at this point in the game, I would strongly advise people not to try to build this wheel themselves. Use the wheels that are built and have something that is defensible, effective, that protects the public, protects all the kids, all the teachers, all the parents, but is also protective of the students of concern. That again, we try to slow them down in that pathway, turn them around, and reconnect them as pro-social students. And we include them, we connect with them, we build those relationships. That's the most effective way to do this. The questions that we ask will tell us I won't say level of concern, but it will give us, those questions will give us the risk factors that we'll focus on when we do that management strategy. So instead of like looking at, well, this is a high risk or a medium risk kid, we look at the risk factors. This is a student who's thinking of hurting themselves. This is a student with a grievance, a student who's kind of thought about and even planned hurting other people. We address those risk factors, and that's how we decrease the risk. And so if you're looking at a model, you want a model that does those things.
Glenn.
Two things I did, and I think in the resources that'll be linked later, I did put John's website in there so he doesn't have to endorse himself. It has a phenomenal set of resources. His book, Youth Violence Prevention, is really good. I got that right after it came out, and it has, I think, 8 kind of vignettes that you follow through. So if you're looking for sample cases, they're kind of baked in. We refer that book to people all the time in our state. It's a really good resource. And what just echoing what John said is there are a lot of really good existing models, and they've gone through a lot. Our framework is based on Colorado School Safety Centers, which is an NTAC-based model. And but we took some components of what Wisconsin and Virginia have done too, because they're just a better fit for what our state needs to offer. And NTAC, they will do policy reviews. They'll review your structured professional judgment tool or whatever you're utilizing, and kind of give you advice and input on that as well. So that's a resource a lot of people aren't aware of. And I want to caution people, because every once in a while we run into a district where they may have a tool that they think is appropriate for this, but it turns out to be something that they call an actuarial assessment, which is a little more rigid, and it's looking at what John was saying you don't really want to look at as kind of a label of how violent is this person, for example, and there's a lot of false positives and false negatives associated with those, so that you can't really effectively use them solely for this. You can use it as an assistance to your process, but that's getting a little bit in the weeds, but we just want to make sure that districts don't rely too heavily on a process that is not appropriate for threat assessment and management.
No, thank you, Glenn. And I just want to remind participants, if you have a question, please hit the Q&A button and we'll get to those. I'm going to ask a question for all three of you if you're either one of you are able to share this. But is there like a case study or a scenario that you've experienced, obviously completely anonymously here, but where you can help illustrate what the whole behavioral threat assessment process looks like from the time that the dots emerged with the student, and then with the time those dots were connected, and then the following steps. Is that something that you're able to share, just to kind of give us a good picture of what this looks like from a model perspective? Glenn, please.
Yeah, I can. One that we had, I'm not going to say when, I don't want it to be identifiable, and I'm going to retract a lot of information, obviously, but we had a young man that he made a spontaneous statement that kids were making jokes with him, and he kind of ran with it just based on his appearance. He started saying, "I do look like a school shooter." And this was kind of locker room talk that spun because a third party heard it that wasn't involved. And then it spread through the school because of an actual event that happened in the nation. So there was a lot of trepidation during that time, and that's something we typically see. So with that, we did have some interesting aspects to that we had to manage, and the parent in that case had a bad experience at their prior school. So we had to show that we're not looking at a zero tolerance policy in this. We're looking at managing the situation and getting him back on track if there is a problem. And it was actually very, very easily to resolve. But one of the biggest problems was he had made some statements that were very concerning and done some things that actually fell into the discipline code in a minor way. But our main concern was his reentry and reintegration back into the school setting. So that was part of the case management. So we actually did a home visit and worked some role play issues on how he's going to deal with the confrontation from the other students. Now that's something that we recommend a lot of times in our training, is really having a robust process if your child or the student is out for any length of time, how to bring them back successfully so that all of your students, parents, etc., have an understanding with information that you can share as transparent as possible and have a good outcome with it. And in that case, it was very favorable.
And Glenn, just to touch base, so what were the initial touch points? Was it, and once again, this may not be appropriate, but did a student report this to the principal, and the principal called together a counselor, a school psychologist? I mean, how did that actual workflow happen?
It was, we get a lot of reports very early in most instances. And at first, it wasn't like that, but it took a while to build those relationships and that culture. So they understood reporting was not going to necessarily get someone in trouble. It was going to get someone help or get a situation resolved. And so now we have a pretty high degree of trust with our student population. Definitely not perfect, but so we were inundated with reports. So reports came to multiple people, and it all filtered immediately to members of our behavioral threat assessment team. And then we were able to converge we do a screening as part of it, and then we bring in the other members for a full assessment if needed. And this one required a lot of more management than it should have, because the actual threat we deemed was very minimal, but the fear that was induced from this was very, very high. There was a lot of explaining and trust building that we had to do with a lot of parents. So that sometimes is one of the biggest factors.
Got it. John, I think you have some insights on that as well.
Sure, I can give you two cases. I'll give you a reference to one, and then I'll just tell you a little bit about the other. Both, I can share names. The first is the Eric Ayala case that is highlighted in Mark Fulman's book, Trigger Points, which is a history of behavioral threat assessment and management, starting with protecting presidents and dignitaries and working its way to schools. And Eric was an early case of mine. There are articles in Esquire magazine and in Mother Jones about Eric, so I'll let people go to the website and they can link. I put the second case link in the chat, and it's an NPR piece called "When Teens Threaten Violence, a Community Responds with Compassion," and it's about Mishka, who was a Russian immigrant to an old believer Russian community where new Russians were not as well accepted as you would think, and he had a pretty tough run of it, and he got on social media, and this is early on in open source investigations. So we had an expert, Courtney McCarthy, and others working to look into this information, and Mishka was soliciting help for He referenced a school shooting, and then also his choice of weapons was also baseball bats. And we got involved in Mishka's life from a community perspective as well as the school. So in the Salem-Keizer model, you don't just have a school team, you have a community team that is robust. It is a well-trained group. Again, it can be lean if you don't have a lot of resources, or it can be hefty. And our community team got involved, and in this story, we were very quick to determine that Mishka was well on his way to getting in a lot of trouble and possibly hurting people. And what we did is, from behind the curtain, we managed this case by working with his parents and avoiding an expulsion by transferring him to alt ed, where we had set up for him a mentor, one of our best mentors in the district. His name's Stan Roberts. He's also a part of this article. So Mishka's interviewed, I'm interviewed, and so is Stan. And we also had a math teacher who was going to help Mishka with his credit deficiency so we could graduate him. We also needed to keep Mishka busy. He liked to work with mechanics. I'm talking about the management side of this, not the assessment side. And one of the things we did is we took $80 out of a little grant that we had, and we bought a Volkswagen engine, and his parents set that engine up on a big blanket in his living room. He would take it apart and put it back together. And we got Mishka through. He graduated. He went on. He was able to get away from some of the influences that were encouraging to act out violently. And again, this is a kid who had a very rough go of it as he moved into the country. He was in a lot of fights, and he was pretty brutally beaten a couple of times. And he'll tell his whole story if you want to listen to that article. This is where it gets interesting, though. 8 years later, I'm the director of the security wing of the district, and I'm told by my field coordinator that Mishka is back at North High School, which is the high school that he attended, and he's now a security sub for our department. Now he's with a private contracting group. They provide subs. And I thought, this is real interesting. I'm going to go chat with Mishka. But it coincidentally, Ritu Chatterjee at NPR was doing this piece on our system, and she was leaning on me to come up with somebody she could interview. And my policy is I don't do that. I don't go find people that have gone through our system and say, hey, will you talk to the press? I've never done that. But coincidentally, here's Mishka, right? So I go out and I say hello to him and introduce myself. He's long forgotten me. And he says, yeah, I caused a lot of trouble in this school. And I said, I know. And we had this conversation, and he agreed to do the interview and tell this story from his perspective, because from his perspective, he had no idea this many adults were involved in his life, helping him out and helping him be successful while keeping everyone safe, including his primary target, the principal. He didn't have any idea all that was going on. He thought he got in a little trouble, and that, hey, look, I got some extra help out of that. And it's a real interesting interview. The link is in the chat, or again, you can link to it from my website. But it's a wonderful story of how the behavioral, the preventive work not stopped Mishka in his pathway, but it didn't just leave him. It didn't expel him. It didn't cast him out of the school. It embraced him and brought him closer through mentorship and academic support. He's a very bright kid. He's done very well in his life since then.
No, that's fascinating, John. And it all goes back to trust and the whole perspective that this is not about discipline, it's about getting help, right? And Allison, I mean, how do you build trust with the school community, with the students, that if you do see something of concern, to help report it, you talk about the dots, that you're not snitching on someone, you're not like Glenn mentioned, having an anonymous reporting system, but how do you establish that level of trust that you're not going to be snitching on a fellow student or getting them in trouble?
Well, I think part of it is exactly having some of those anonymous reporting systems, because it just gives them the freedom. In Michigan, we have OK to Say, which can go through the Michigan State Police, but we also internally in our district have an anonymous reporting, and we've had instances of staff sharing it, just things that they've noticed. And so it's just creating that see something, say something culture, because it's not up to any student or any staff member to make the determination if it's something. I always like to say, kind of like our dogs, when they hear a funny noise, they tilt their head. Like if it's something that makes you tilt your head, report it. It doesn't matter how big or small it is. Let us help you and let us take care of that part. You just let us know when there's something concerning. And just creating that culture across the board. And what we've actually seen is a lot more reporting of students reporting other students, their friends that have expressed suicidal ideation. So between the training that we've done in like our homeroom classes and our advisory about suicidal warning signs and things like that, we've had a lot of reporting that way more than anything else. And so it just becomes part of who we are. We're here to support each other, not get each other in trouble. We want to help.
No, that's great, Allison, and that's something we've been talking about all year as well as the role of culture and that the shared responsibility and it's okay. We got a couple questions that came in beforehand, and Glenn, I'll direct this at you because we were talking about grant funding right before we started here. But we have a question here from a registrant. What grants and other funding are available for BTAM training? Is there anything specific for that, or is that just a general school safety and security program?
This is a tough question. I saw that in advance, and some of the grant funding is not available anymore. I always direct people to grants.gov is a great starting point, and schoolsafety.gov has a good resource for looking at grants as well. But we have lost some of the grants were specifically directed towards behavioral threat assessment and management and building teams at localized or state levels. So, and then some of the grants where you previously were able to use the funding for this topic, they've shifted some of the dynamics of it. So it's cyclic. What we always tell people is have your wish list ready for when the grant comes up. So they sometimes aren't predictable. And sometimes states will do localized efforts for grants as well, or there'll be a nonprofit that offers something. But have your wish list done and have some get bids already for when you need that. But also a lot of this is there's no cost. So you can do a lot of it without any funding. We provide all of our stuff for free. There's a lot of people in this industry, and even if there is a consultation fee or the initial fee for training, that is pretty minimal in the scope of what you're getting. So it's something that like New York State, I was talking to one of their folks, and they had a big grant process that offered, but they're like, it's like we had this money offered, but really people don't need it too much because they find that a lot of the resources you can provide for it for little to no cost.
Exactly. And that's what I was thinking as well when you were responding to that, because, I mean, aside from the training, I mean, are there hard costs associated with having a behavioral threat assessment team, right? Or is it the people you already have the head count? It's just a matter of getting those folks trained. So that seems to be key factor, right? I mean, what are the hard costs?
One of the essential things elements to a good person on your team is a problem solver, because you will run into, if you're a big district or a small district, it doesn't matter. You will run into challenges and difficulties, and you have to be able to work through them. And one of those things is customization, where you may need to hire personnel in order to accommodate your needs. You may need a mental health professional, and that's why we talk about gathering data too. Look at the data that you collect. How many of these cases did you work? What was the result? Is there evidence of disproportionality? Are you treating everybody equally the way they should be based on what's happening? Inordinate number of arrests. So you look at all these factors, but you also look at in your process some of the qualitative data, like, hey, we really wanted to do this. We wanted to have the student back, but we didn't have the right people to help with supervision on that. So that allowed us, that forced us into a more restrictive setting. So how do we solve that? So some of the costs are personnel related, so you can increase bandwidth, but otherwise it's travel, consultation, training. But again, even those, there are low to no cost options on most of them.
Exactly. John and Allison, I want to get your thoughts on this too, because we obviously have a number of school safety and security directors as part of this community and participating today. And we had roundtables the last couple of weeks on this topic. But from your perspective, what is the role of a school safety and security director when it comes to the behavior threat assessment team and management?
You asking that one of me?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Well, it depends on the job description. So, sometimes these systems aren't run from the security wing. They are run out of student services. In fact, I would say not a majority, but probably a third or more that I work with are coordinated at least from the student services wing and then connected in security. And I like that relationship because ultimately the security part of this, or what's called the LEUR, the law enforcement unit record, which doesn't have anything to do with being a sworn law enforcement unit, but it's FERPA language. You want that housed in your security wing. So I would say the role of a director, a security director who often now is in some management capacity of emergency management, risk management, and behavioral threat assessment, that person manages the system, and that it's likely that your lead, if you have lead trainers, if you have a big enough district, you have a person with a dedicated full-time equivalent job to running these systems, behavioral threat assessment or suicide prevention, that's likely going to be a school psychologist or a school social worker, could be a retired or an administrator, but and that person might be housed in the student services wing, but they would work together in managing the structure. But your security director should be trained at a level of expertise. That would be somebody who's more than just been trained by, say, me or NTAC or something like that, but that they are members of the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. They are seeking out trainings from experts like Reed Malloy and Steve White and Chris Mohandi, and folks that are really, they're the ones you want on your side while you're doing this, because they're going to help you maintain fidelity and ask the right questions. So regardless of what the job description says, so if it's just security, like physical security or operational security, I think that director should have an expertise in this at this point in our evolution of school prevention and school safety.
And Allison, I mean, you've had a amazing cross section between safety directors and school administrators in the last couple of weeks. And so, what is your perspective on the role of a safety and security director in a BTAM?
And to kind of echo what John says, it really depends on what their defined role is. I think my title says it perfectly because it's safety, security, and student services. So it's a little bit of everything. But I view my role as the trainer, as the facilitator. I'm there to support. I'm not there to give them answers. They can call me if they have questions, but more than likely I'm going to ask them questions back because it's a team decision. It's a team effort. And so really looking at who are the go-tos for that person, no matter what department it's in. Who is that person that's a school psych that you can rely on? And being able to build that capacity within the district, because one person cannot hold all of the cards and all of the answers. And there is the times where, they may get sick. And so who's that next person? And constantly training up in that ongoing learning opportunities. But really, again, defining what that role is. What is the expectation for each member of the team? How does that adhere to what laws are in place? Because we don't have a lot of states where they require threat assessment. But for those that do, what are your requirements in your state for that? And really anchoring yourself in law and policy first so that you know that you have ground to stand on, kind of like what you talked about. All of us have talked about actually the whole time, is being able to ground ourselves in what is defensible. And so I view my role as more of that facilitator. I'm here to support, but I'm not giving you all the answers. And I don't have all the answers either, but I have people I can call.
Exactly. Since you mentioned statewide programs, Glenn, in Missouri, I mean, you mentioned that, Missouri is one of the states that does require a safety and security director at every school or district. Is there a standardized role or job description that incorporates the connection between that position and the behavior threat assessment team?
It's in our statute, it's pretty loose guidance right now. So we have a safety bill that we're waiting to see if it gets signed by the governor, but it'll give a little more clarification, but still relatively broad. So we try and give guidance based on what the statute says on what those expectations are, because otherwise it was just overly broad and too inclusive. If you look at it, it says you have to know almost everything about school violence prevention, with no guidance. So that's what we try and do, is kind of bridge that, give some clarity to it. Because like I said, our bigger districts, they'll have good continuity of their school safety folks, but our smaller districts, which is the majority of our state, we have to learn it as we go, and sometimes there is no path that's been established. So yeah, that's where your school safety entities or some of your kind of champions for safety in your state or your region will come in handy. Organizations like this, you can get some guidance on standardization and what is important. So it's taken a few years, but this is probably our most sought after training, is behavioral threat assessment and management. So we're really inundated with requests for it, which is a good problem to have.
And that's a great point, Glenn. And that's really part of the impetus behind the National Council of School Safety Directors, because it is a new profession. It really is. I mean, most safety directors that we have and security directors in the organization, they're the first person filling that role in their district. And so the idea of establishing what are some standards or expectations from this role from a national basis, and every state's going to be a little bit different, of course, but what are some of those core expectations, responsibilities, roles as this profession, continues to develop, and having input on that is something that is absolutely critical to this whole process. So, and you mentioned something else that struck a nerve as well, is the whole fact that we're on this journey, and that's kind of like the whole metaphor we look at with Zero Now, is we're on this path to safer schools, but it is a journey, and we want to hear from one another, like, do this works phenomenally well. Don't do this. We tried this and this worked horribly, but sharing those best practices as we're going on that journey. And I hate using the Mary, who's on here, is probably going to kick me under the desk here, but it's like the AAA of school safety. We have a map. Here's how you get from Missouri to Connecticut, and learn from others that have traveled along the way, places to stop and visit, the experiences that you have to share with others. We just have about 9 minutes left, so I have a couple more questions that came from participants that submitted their questions online. And if we don't have time to answer all the questions, we'll come back to it later. So Doug Snow from Mountain Crest asks, what are your suggestions? And this is open to either one of you. What are your suggestions for case management and keeping students connected to the school after the threat assessment? So how do you manage that, Allison?
We've done a lot of work, and it's I always say I come from the land of education. I was a teacher first, campus administrator. I was an MTSS coordinator at one point in my career as well. And so really leaning into that, our multi-tiered system of support, our response to intervention framework. So I partner with my director of MTSS here, and we look at that. Okay, that threat assessment is completed. We've created that safety plan. We've created that management plan. Now, how do we shift them over to our MTSS framework? Because they're still, even if it was a low level event, we still want to check in and make sure that they belong. Maybe they need small groups. We have a lot of different small groups that our counseling teams meet with. And what does that look like for that student? How do we ensure that just because that behavior they're off the pathway to violence, we have a safety plan, we have a care management plan, whatever is determined for that one. But what is that ongoing support that we can provide that student? Because we are in the land of education first. We want these students at the end of the day to be prepared to face the world, get a high school diploma, learn a trade, a skill, do early college, all of the different pathways we can offer them now. But in order to do that, no one can do it alone. And so being able to even just have conversations, whether it's, I know here in Oxford, our high school teams, they meet together once a week to talk about different PBIS initiatives, our positive behavior intervention support, and our MTSS, and add those kids to the conversation so that they do have that connectedness to school. I think that's a huge piece.
No, that's great, Allison. And on that note, Glenn or John, are there tools like, we talk about the input and, the gathering of the information and all that, and the management? Is it something as simple as using an Excel spreadsheet with students and where they are, or are there more sophisticated systems? Let's say that you have a very low budget or you can't afford that. I mean, are there any leading practices around tracking, following up, collecting all those dots, that come in to be able to connect those? Glenn, let's say in Missouri.
Well, I wanted to cheat and hear what John had to say because I know what we do in Missouri, but I'll tell you we do anything and everything. There are a lot of third-party vendors, and there's some interesting things that are on the horizon too. And I used to shy away from because it's a big industry, school safety, and there are people with really good hearts that are pushing into it and trying to do good things. But then there are some that maybe they're just trying to make money. So. For the most part, though, people want to do good, and I've realized that, and I'm less jaded now. And what I've realized too is you have to look at the personnel and the human capital expenditure that you have. So if someone is spending full time on case management and completing everything and doing everything, maybe it is best to spend so many thousands of dollars a year on a third party capture device. There's several out there. A lot of the big companies have one. Rickshaw's is really interesting, but there's just tons out there. What most of our schools do is they do use a variation of a Excel tool. We give them some things as a starting point, but they'll use the combination of calendar notifications and Excel tools to be able to push information out. It's more labor intensive. But it keeps people on track with reminders, etc. So it can be as simple as that. Most of our schools will use Google Drive, and we say, oh, that's not as secure, but it's what they use. So they'll make a whole drive that kind of captures stuff. So we caution them about it, but they have to make it functional for what they can do. So we give the guidance and show them some things and give them some samples and let them run from there.
John.
First of all, I think of these as fluid assessments. They don't just end when the assessment's over. Think of like a satellite is going over a weather system and it takes a snapshot of that weather system. When it comes back around, the weather system has changed. And the variables contextually that change that weather system in threat assessment are the things we do to disrupt that pathway. So we're always working with that student. Some students retire out because we solve the problem rather quickly, but they're still on our radar. And other kids take sometimes years. Mishka was a 2-year project, and we were involved. Now, the way we tracked that back then is we had a full-time person that did that. And so the formula, I'll just give you the quick formula. Between 30 and 40,000 students will justify and require the equivalent of a full-time person, training, tracking, helping, supporting, especially the most serious cases. And that's a formula that is applied everywhere I've gone. And that's about the amount of work. The way we've tracked it is with the calendar notifications. Early on, I helped our tech people use SharePoint to build a platform that if you think about it, the easiest way to track these cases and remind people that they're doing interventions and checking in with kids and keeping them close would be an electronic system that would take care of that stuff for you. So you're not having to organize your calendar every day, that you're being reminded this case is still active. There are these 5 components that are left to be addressed: counseling, getting this kid back in music lessons, whatever those are. And the electronic systems I've seen that work the best are fairly sophisticated. Google Docs, I've seen people do it, and it does have definitely problems. This is where my only point where I will make a pitch. Public Consulting Group does have a web-based platform that does that, and I've helped design that initially. We are redesigning that, and it will cover CSTAG, NTAC, and Salem-Kaiser Cascade. And that is a very efficient way to do the work. If you don't have the bucks for that, you do the best you can to package it. On my website, you'll have all the PDF forms for the entire system, all the interviews, and they're somewhat interactive. There are references and portals, and they will help you track. You just go to the website, go to resources, PDF forms, and take a look, and you can just download those.
Awesome. Thank you, John. And we are completely out of time, but just wanted to give each of you an opportunity just to leave any final thoughts or words of wisdom for our participants as we wrap things up. Obviously, very very robust topic, and we'll continue discussing this in the upcoming year. But Glenn, we'll start with you. Any final thoughts that you have for our participants?
Sure. Start wherever you're at. You're already managing threats, even if you don't have an organized team, just do it. And my friend Bruno Diaz has a great example of when we all look at the pathway to violence. If you're not familiar with that, just Google it, you'll find it. But on the pathway to violence, prior to grievance, that's where we really want to work. We want to be in that space where we're helping kids before it gets to a grievance, if possible, or if they hit a grievance, they already have developed relationships in your school district where they know where to go and how to resolve that without moving to ideation or something worse. So work in that realm as best you can. It's not always possible, but that's my best advice. You will have a lot happier time at your district.
Exactly. And John said in the first question, it's about prevention, right? It's all about prevention. We don't want to have to respond. If we could, the path to safer schools, if we get ended at prevention, that we're in great shape. But John, final thoughts from you, sir.
Yeah, I'll just right from prevention, I'll go one step back to early intervention, which is what Glenn was just talking about. So if you're doing things in your education culture to keep kids connected and supported, you are going to decrease the number of these assessments you have to do. You're going to have to do some, so you'll need a system, again, that's defensible, leading practice, and get you where you want to go while keeping kids connected and in school. But if you can just think on the early intervention side, the most disconnected, disenfranchised kids who would have or are building a reason to want to hurt themselves or others, and you can get in front of that, like Glenn said or Bruno said, that is really where you can save yourself a lot of time and heartache.
100%. Allison, final thoughts from you, please.
Completely agree with both what Glenn and John said, and just that idea of just start where you are. But once you have the training, that's not enough. You got to keep the conversation going. Take that time to calibrate, have little conversations, even if it's just, I know Vermont Safety Center has some really good, like 5-minute tabletops. Maryland has some great 10-minute ones. They don't have to always be EOP associated when you think about a tabletop, but keep that conversation going and build trust within your team, because that's when you're really going to be able to sit and have those vulnerable conversations. These are tough things to talk about. And the more that we can come together on it as a school community, the better it is for our kids in the end.
Thank you so much, Allison, Glenn, John. Just to remind folks, the Zero Knot Annual Meeting is July 21st at Campus Safety Conference. Also, if you're interested in joining the National Council of School Safety Directors, just go to ncssd.org, join, be a part of this broader conversation as we help develop this role. But thank you so much, Allison, Glenn, and John. We'll see you all soon. Take care, everybody.